Welcome to Snark Chocolate, a show about ZK products, where we break them down with rich flavors and sweet insights. I'm Queenie, and I'll be co hosting this episode together with Omer. Today, we're thrilled to be joined by Anna Rose, who created Zero Knowledge Podcast, Zero Knowledge Validator, ZK Summit, and zkHack, all the ZK products we love. Anna, it's great to have you on the show.
Oh, thanks. Nice to be here.
Yeah, so we actually have this longest question list we've ever prepared for a guest. We're just super curious about you and everything you're building.
Cool. It's very interesting to be on the other side of this podcast. As I said when I joined, um, I'm usually the person asking the questions. And so, yeah, it's going to be funny to hear for me to be the one speaking more this time.
Yeah, I hope you'll enjoy it. So, Anna, I think everyone listening to this podcast already knows your name well, but could you please take us back to the very beginning and share how your journey into blockchain and the cryptography first began?
So my story with zero knowledge starts when I had a startup back in 2013, video tech startup, not blockchain, not distributed systems. But and I can tell the story about my startup. My startup, in a way, I'm very proud of what we were able to accomplish, but it wasn't a roaring success. It sort of plateaued as a company. We ran it for, I think in total about 6 years, but really the first 3 years, we put everything into it, and it never fully accelerated. And so around that time, I started to look around at new topics, new ideas. I had some friends who worked at Parity in Berlin. I'm trying to pronounce it correctly because if you say it too fast, Parity sounds like a different word. But anyway, Parity, who were at the time doing the Ethereum client and eventually developed Polkadot, they were I knew them personally kind of through tech. And I joined that company back in 2017 as sort of special projects. My startup wasn't going anywhere, and I had been the CEO of my company, but I knew I needed to make a shift and a move. And so I had a few options. I was also thinking of starting a new company myself in a very different direction, but I made the decision to join this crazy blockchain company at the moment that they were doing their ICO. And it was an incredibly exciting moment, but I was a bit lost in the company because I had been the CEO, and then all of a sudden I was I didn't really have a role. I remember this very young dev asking me if I was the intern, and it was quite a blow to my ego. But also I was sort of flattered that he thought I was 20 when I was not. But yeah, I had a bit of a hard time finding my footing and exactly what I could contribute to the space because it was so technical. And my startup had been very Web 2, and it was not that technical. So I was kind of jumping into the deep end. But while I was there, one of my colleagues, Frederick, sort of threw out this idea of hey, does anyone want to do a podcast? Because he was also new to the space. He was way more technical than me, like an engineer, but there was a lot for him to learn as well. And because I had done video tech before, we had created quite a lot of content as part of our company. Our company was a SaaS video product. That was my startup. So I was used to, content marketing and building these little productions and stuff like that. So yeah, he said, does anyone want to do a podcast? I put my hand up, and that's how the podcast started.
Cool. So, was naming the podcast Zero Knowledge just a coincidence?
Yeah, so this question is a good one. I would say a few years ago, if you'd asked me this question, I would have said yes. It was someone threw it out in the room, we thought it was funny, and then we named our show Zero Knowledge, right?
Yeah.
But more recently, in 2023, I made this discovery about a company called Zero Knowledge Systems that was from the late 90s. And by the way, I've told this story as an episode on a recent show, on the Zero Knowledge podcast. So anyone who's heard that, this story already. But basically, I found out that there had been this company in the late 90s in Montreal where I lived. And when I I found them through trademark research, but their office had been across the street from a bar that I hung out in all the time. And so I all of a sudden realized like the name Zero Knowledge, I had actually seen it probably and like possibly met people who had told me about this concept, but like in the year 2000. I'm outing myself right now as a very old, very much like a boomer of this space. But yeah, like back then, I was not really in tech. I was studying. I was kind of hanging out in this bar a lot. But yeah, there was this company called Zero Knowledge Systems just across the street. And that coincidence has really made me rethink why I was potentially attracted to the name Zero Knowledge. Like, it's possible that it kind of came back up and I was like, this looks familiar and interesting. And then was like, let's name it that. I don't know. That's like me, I'm kind of retelling it after I found out this piece of information, but.
Yeah, I think that's more than just a coincidence. That's destiny, probably.
It's too weird, yeah. It was so weird when I found out. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I tell this story like with a little bit more gravitas in this episode that I recorded, and I don't know if you can link to it in the show notes or something, but it's a short one. It's only 15 minutes. But I think in that you'd potentially hear like why this was so shocking and how like incredibly close I was to this company without really knowing them. Like I didn't work there. I didn't go into their office or anything, but yeah.
That's the magical moment. So I asked this question because I actually noticed the first episode on Zero Knowledge Proofs aired back in April 2018. So at what point did this podcast shift towards, the deeper cryptography and ZK focus that we see today?
Yeah, so the show actually started in 2017, late 2017, but we were just kind of testing out stuff. The early episodes are pretty bad, in my opinion. Nobody needs to listen to them. And in January 2018, we started to air it weekly. So I think even those episodes that are like in January were actually recorded in the fall before we sort of started to air them. It took us until episode 11 to come up with the name. So originally it was just like me and Frederick and our original, like we had a third co-host for a little while. I think he lasted 2 episodes or something. But we ended up being me and Frederick exploring blockchain concepts mostly. Episode 11, we named it Zero Knowledge. We thought it was kind of funny. Episode 21, we introduced Zero Knowledge for the first time. And I think that's what you're referring to. When we actually started to cover it was quite late. I mean, it took, I think, like personally, it took me a long time to get enough just general blockchain cryptography insight to be able to start to tackle that problem and that topic. But by the end of 2018, I think we had like 4 or 5 guests on who actually worked in ZK. And by the end of 2019, when there was the Snarktember and this boom in research, we actually had a program that was like, I think something like 80% ZK content or maybe 90%. Like not every episode was on ZK, but there was so much stuff on ZK that we could cover that all of a sudden there was enough to fill a weekly show. Because I will say this, like when we started, I don't think there was. We could have interviewed zkHack, which we did end up doing for, I think, episode 50. But it was like, there was Coda. There wasn't very much in 2017. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
It's funny because now we actually, in our podcast, we cover on a weekly basis companies doing ZK. Just like look at how the space evolved.
Well, this was, I mean, back then there was zkHack, which was like the only, zkHack and Zcoin, I think were the only main companies doing it. There was Kedit, although that maybe was later, that was doing like some research projects around it. But otherwise, it was researchers, right? It was like paper writers. And a lot of the companies we had were more blockchain. I do want to say, like, I do think that the show, like Frederick starting with me, like having an engineer at the start was kind of key. I don't think I could have really done this show without having a very technical co-host at the start. Because I was like, we were in a very technical space. And if I had just been covering like more high-level blockchain stuff in 2017, it would have been like an ICO show, right? Like very different vibe. I think because like Frederick definitely knew a lot more about cryptography as well. Like he was kind of coming in with more of a math engineering background. I got to kind of work with him where like putting together a show, there's like your tag teaming. One person's maybe looking more at background, one person's looking more at the technical deep dives. And over time, I think I did, especially for ZK stuff, I started to pick it up enough that by the third year, this is when Frederick left. He left at the very end of year 3. And he didn't just leave the show, he actually left the industry. Like he was kind of done. It was very sad for us. I'd love to someday bring him back as like a guest or something, but maybe we get to do it. But yeah, when he left, I remember thinking like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this on my own because like I'm really not technical enough, I felt. But at least on the ZK front, I turned out like I had picked up a fair bit to at least be able to hold an interview. You know, I don't know if I could have explained all of the things we were talking about, you know, without prep and, but yeah.
Yeah. So I think what you mentioned, the setup is quite similar to we have currently at Snark Chocolate. I cannot do it alone without Omer.
Queenie, I'm your Frederick, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Nice.
I wanted to ask Anna, how do you hold the conversation a week after week on like super hardcore technical topics? What's the playbook?
Yeah, this is a funny one. Okay, so I have thought about that. Like how, like I talk to people who are talking about things that I don't, like I'm not deep in those things. I mean, okay, for certain things like ZK research, I do feel like having done as many episodes and also having produced the whiteboard sessions and having, you know, done study groups myself on those, I feel a little bit more well-versed. But I will say that, especially early on, what I had to do was like go into an interview where I knew very, very little. And what I learned, I think I actually picked this up from moving to Germany and not speaking the language that well. Like, my German's okay now, but like when I first moved there, you'd have conversations with Germans and you would only understand like 60% of the words. And you're sort of trying to piece together the rest, but you don't want to interrupt the conversation. This is something I think anyone who's learned a second language and lived in the place has probably experienced. And I think what I kind of got good at was like bluffing, like just kind of like going through it. Like, I don't really understand what you said, but I'm going to keep the conversation going. I'm not going to stop you and be like, every word I don't get, what do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean? And it was kind of this like, just go with it. And then over time, especially with a language, you do that enough, you actually do pick it up. Now, transition this to the Zero Knowledge podcast, I get the sense that I had sort of developed a bit of that skill, something that I will say I did not have before. Before, when I was like in an English-speaking place, I probably would have stopped people every step of the way because I didn't understand something. But yeah, having gone through that experience of living in a place with a different language, which I didn't speak that well for a while, I think I got better at entering into a conversation where some of the words I don't understand and knowing how to like still keep the flow going enough and not interrupting it too dramatically. And over time, you do actually learn those words. Like you learn them by studying them after the interview. You learn them when, you know, I'm writing the show notes or I'm doing research to like finish off the show. Yeah, and I think that's how I do that. Now I'm exploring other realms like outside of ZK, and I feel I'm in the same position. Like I have to accept that there's going to be a percentage of terms that I won't understand, and I have to sort of choose wisely. Like sometimes I think the listener also doesn't know, and then I think it's important to clarify. But when I think the listener probably knows, then I kind of push through and I try to kind of figure it out as I go. I'm sort of like piecing together, what do they mean by that term? And maybe later on I'm like, I think I got it. That's my theory anyway.
That's a nice theory. I can give one kind of like anti-pattern, which I discovered listening to a podcast called 20VC. Like the guy always catches up on the latest, like on the final sentence of the answer and kind of like repeat the last sentence and then kind of like phrase it as a question. I don't think that's very good. I think that your approach of kind of like piecing this like, you know, mental puzzle and you know, practicing it over many years, I guess, makes it like, makes you very, very good at doing that is probably a much better way to approach it.
Yeah, I have heard one other person describe a very similar thing. It was like somebody speaking in a completely different context in like another podcast, but it was someone who is in physics and was talking about like reading biotech things and described a very similar phenomenon, which is like you can't get fixated on the details you don't understand because it will be overwhelming to learn all of those terms before, and you won't be able to retain it. So you have to sort of skate on top of it and like go like read those papers with like a little bit of a blurry eye. Like don't worry about the details until you start to pick up the lingo. And that spoke to me. I felt like, yeah, I think that's what I'm doing as well. There's a lot of pattern matching that's happening too. Like people will say a word and I will have heard that word in another interview, and then I have a little bit of context on that little piece, and then we can explore that. Yeah. I remember early on, like meeting people at the ZK Summit who were listening for a while, and they would say, I remember one person came up to me and was like, I can hear you learning. I was like, thanks. He's like, you're asking like better questions. I can tell you've picked up some of this stuff. And I was like, I think so. Yeah.
That's there's probably a bigger insight here, and I mean, or both one. I mean, it's not just like applying to podcasting, but something you have to take for anyone. I wonder how do you select your guests? How do you source them? But how do you decide which one to invite?
I think it depends, but my favorite guests usually come because of an interest or a topic, a thread that like we on the show or me personally am kind of exploring. So I think of, a few years ago I did sort of a series on bridges. I did a series on L2s. This is many years ago, like 2021 or 22 or something. And those were very much directed by like a curiosity, knowing that there was a bunch of teams doing this one thing, and I kind of wanted to explore how they're all approaching it. Other times it's recommendations, intros, usually depending on like who is doing the intro or recommendation. Like if it's a guest I've had on who I thought was great and they're recommending another person, then I'm, a little bit more keen. We get a lot of pitches. I've over the years we've gotten lots and lots of pitches for all sorts of things. I think we're just on some PR mailing list because a lot of them are so out of context. The funniest ones that I still get today are when they're like, "Hello, Anna and Frederick. We would like to come on," and I'm just like, guys, I mean, he left in 2020. You're clearly not listening, but it's sort of, I think my favorite episodes usually come from a curiosity that's being satisfied. That's like what I'm usually going for. We do get pitched a lot. I think there's a lot of teams that want to come on the show to talk about announcements. I tend to encourage them not to because I think of the show not as like a news show. Like, also, it's not like I don't find that interesting usually. What I'm interested in are potentially breakthroughs, like a new paradigm, a new application, like a new space that's a new team is exploring. Like those are the things that are exciting to me. Yeah. And like just an updated product more for retail or sort of to get investors' attention, it's like that's a bit less interesting.
Anna, do you have top 3 favorite episodes?
I prepared this a little bit. That's hard. That's super hard because actually if you were to say like I have a top 3 from the last 3 months, and then I have a top 3 kind of all time. But if I go back, to 2020, there were very impactful episodes back then, which maybe today aren't quite as relevant. But yeah, it was hard to pick a favorite. But I would say that I can say 3 that I do have off the top of my head. Dan Bonnet, I've actually had him on 3 times, I think. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to group those as one. But every time I've had him on, we've talked about kind of novel research, often into applications that he and his group are talking about or that he's interested in. Those, to me, have predicted the future, like multiple times. So that's been awesome. We also got to collaborate on the whiteboard sessions, Dan and I. So like I learn a lot from those interviews, and I think they get referenced a lot. The next one I would pick would be Ariel Gabizon's ZK Trilogy, which was recorded in 2023. And it was just like, it was his attempt to put the history of snarks into, I mean, a really cool format, like sort of a three-parter and how things change. I think if he was to do one again, it would be different, actually, because I think his focus at the time was like a little bit more on lookup arguments. And I know his research has kind of moved to different spaces there. But I loved that format. It helped me to just, I don't know, to frame all of these things we'd been learning and talking about in a really good way. And then I would say an episode that was impactful and a little bit more recent was, it was with Arnaud. It was called On Trust Infrastructure. And this was like, it was different because it was almost like a bit of a critique of like pure decentralization governance. And it hadn't been something I'd been thinking about before. But I know like Nico and I did that interview, and the challenges in our space started to look a little more clear after having done that interview. Because I felt like, yeah, it just raised a few kind of like issues with assumptions that we make about how networks and extremely decentralized spaces operate. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. And also, I'm super curious. Do you know who are actually listening to the podcast?
Well, I meet a lot of them. I mean, the ZK Summit event, I think, is kind of it's a chance for a lot of the listeners to come together and meet each other. So I'd say, like, yes, I get to meet them through the ZK Summit. And we know that it's a very technical audience. There's a lot of engineers, a lot of researchers, a lot of, like, the professors. A lot of the guests seem to have also been listeners, because we'll often invite them on and they'll be like, I'm a listener. And I'll be like, cool. So, like, yeah, I think it's like, that's who I would guess are mostly our listeners.
So is the majority of them still from Web3 industry?
That's a good question. I mean, they're mostly engineers, I think, and researchers. I think probably the majority is still like at least decentralized web adjacent, I think. Yeah.
It's cool.
That's actually not a question I've asked, but maybe a good one to ask on like a future survey or something like that.
Yeah, I saw on Twitter that your podcast says 2025 is the year of change. So what kind of changes do you think we'll see this year?
I think in general, the entire blockchain space is very different. And I think I've been kind of waiting for the ZK space to decouple a little bit from that. And I don't know if it's 2025, but I think it could be somewhat this year. I think it'll depend if other larger, more, I don't know, I want to say like tech incumbent teams, like the big ones, if they start to join the ZK space in a real way. And there's definitely signs that they're exploring these things, like teams sending, speakers or trying to apply to speak at the summit from some of these companies. I'm hearing more about like research groups and different orgs that are working on ZK, but they're not really working on ZKX blockchain. They're just like, they're using sort of the acceleration that came through ZK and blockchain combined, like the new libraries, the new concepts, but they can use them for all sorts of different things. So I could see that being part of the change. The other thing I would say, and I think, Omar, you just alluded to this, like most of the teams you're having on here are companies. This is a change that happened between 2022 and 2024, which is all of a sudden it went from scrappy, very small, startup-y, almost hackathon project level teams to like full-fledged organizations with mega budgets, and like they're a real company, they're looking for users. It's like a very different approach. Like there is still the sort of smaller projects, but I think they're much more in the application direct to the user now. They've sort of like moved up the stack. Like all of those companies from 2022, not all, but a lot of them from 2022 to 2024 were infrastructure, ZK for infra, ZK for scaling. It could still be ZK for privacy, but it would be like ZK for compression. It would be all these infrastructure ZK applications. And now you're starting to see people building, things for users. And I feel like that was happening back in 2024. And I feel like there's more projects like that. I love the stage that they're at. That's like personally an interest of mine to explore more of that. And yeah, maybe 2025 is their breakout year. Maybe. I mean, it's still early, so we'll see.
Fingers crossed. I think what you mentioned about the changes in the past few years, it's also the same case for you, right? Like you have now like a ZK family.
I
Besides,
started more companies. I didn't, yeah, I've always had this. I think I like small teams. This is my problem. I really like small teams. I don't really want a big team. And so what would happen is I'd see some kind of opportunity or some like area, and then I'd be like, oh, I think I want to start something over there, kind of on the side of what I'm already doing. And I'd start a new company or start a new project. I feel like I was doing that for the first 6-7 years. And now this past year, if anything, I've kind of been trying to like recombine some of these things. So for example, zkHack was founded in 2021. It was a separate project from ZK Podcast, ZK Summit. But this year, under the hood, we've actually like merged the team because they ended up doing very similar activities. Like they did hackathons, content. Like originally zkHack, we didn't know what it would become. Like we thought maybe it would become like a company builder or like there's all sorts of ideas for what it would be. But really it just started to work in parallel to the summit and to the podcast, like doing very similar activities. And so now that's actually one company, but two brands. We'll keep the communities separate, but like there's definitely going to be a little bit more overlap in the organizational front, which for me is awesome because at some point I was running like 4 different orgs and was like finding it a little bit overwhelming. So yeah, this is nice to do.
Like Elon Musk.
Well, except that now I'm merging them, so different approach, yeah.
What led you to start ZK Summit and how it evolved over time?
So ZK Summit was very much it was the event for the podcast. And this is kind of going back to the naming story. Originally, the ZK Summit, or the Zero Knowledge Summit, was actually just like this podcast summit. I've said this before on the show, but once we had a name, which we did before this event, we called it the Zero Knowledge Summit. And it was kind of lucky, I guess, but I happened to have met Zuko before that and had said we were doing, and I had already named the show, and I said something like, we're doing Zero Knowledge Summit, and he sent someone from the team to speak, Strad. And then I also shared just the invite for Zero Knowledge Summit to some people in Silicon Valley, and they were it landed on the desk of Howard Wu, who was a ZK researcher at the time. And he saw this cool event and was like, I'm coming, and I'm bringing my ZK friends. So that first ZK Summit, despite it really just being like in name only, actually had, I think, half a day of ZK content. And the rest of it was just like blockchain content. We had 4 stages. We've always kind of done it in the same way, like a single day, 4 stages, but half of a day on one of the stages, on the first one, was pure ZK content. So it was the ZK Summit. And then by the second one, end of 2018, we would have the whole main stage was ZK, and then we had blockchain on the other stages. And then by ZK Summit 3, it was probably, 90% ZK.
So ZK Summits are only a single day. Is there a reason behind that?
So there is. I think we have been encouraged, like over the last few sessions at least, to do 2 days or more days, because there's a lot of people applying to speak, and it's a packed day. We end up doing 4 stages. That's kind of our format. We have a main, a side, a breakout, and a workshop room running in parallel. It is intense, but one of my experiences going to a lot of conferences and summits, outside of ours, is that when you do the multi-day, you end up with sort of especially if you do a multi-day for people who go to a lot of these things, people will show up for one of the days, but not both. And so you get sort of this fragmenting of the audience. I feel like because ZK Summit, yes, it's a research heavy, it's really dense, and it's a great place to learn about new stuff, get into conversations. I do want everyone there at the same time. And we found by keeping it to one day, that happens. And it's challenging. There's been summits where we've had 3 or 4 times the number of applications versus the number of speaker spots. So we've had to say no to like fantastic speakers because we just didn't have enough room. It's also been kind of cool because you get to pick, although it's always hard. It's hard because like you never know. We're doing this 3 months in advance too, and I'm sure we've missed gems that could have given great talks. But I do think we've programmed pretty good. I have a small committee helping me now. But yeah, that's basically why we do it as a one day. It's really to get everyone in the same room at the same time.
By the way, we are recording this episode before the Toronto ZK Summit.
Yeah.
So I don't know if there are still any spots left for attendees, but we definitely recommend. I mean, for those who haven't been in ZK Summits, it's an amazing experience, like your safe place. To talk everything ZK and cryptography, programmable cryptography, and so on. And for those that have been there, it's a good place to meet friends and connect again and to see what's the latest.
Yeah. It's very fun every time. And it does feel like kind of a coming home at some, like you kind of get used to seeing some of the same folks. Some of them I only see there. The really cool thing has been, we only started making merch for ZK7 onwards. Like earlier, we just didn't have budget. We didn't really have the design for it either. But by ZK7, we started to do merch. And now when you go to a ZK Summit, you see everyone wearing their ZK 8, 9, 11, whatever. Like they're wearing their T-shirt from the summit they came to. It's really fun.
I remember that at one point on the Telegram group, someone posted a picture of a mug.
The mug.
And then like people started to, we also, by the way, here in the office, we also have like ZK Summit mugs.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
The podcast mug, yes.
I think almost every day someone comes to the office with like a ZK Summit T-shirt. It's a
nice. Yeah, I often, like I'll jump on calls with people sometimes and then I'll notice the sort of the Z kind of top of the Z peeking up.
The logo.
They're wearing some sort of ZK Summit shirt. It's funny.
I wanted to jump to the topic of education, or go back to it a bit, but talk about the business angle of that part. Meaning that you are doing so many on the education front, right? Like we mentioned already, zkHack, the whiteboard sessions, there are like study clubs. I'm assuming that even companies emerged out of the connections made in some of these events. Which is amazing, and we love you for that. But I'm really curious if like what's in it for you, like what gets you to keep doing this kind of like activities around like education and community building.
Yeah, I think early on, I think I have a bit of a kind of organizer, founder. Like I like to do things. I like to organize things. This has been sort of consistent through my life. I think with my startup, that was the first time it was formalized that I could like come up with an idea and then execute the idea. And I get kind of fixated on doing that. So, and I think what I've learned with the podcast is the routine of podcast. The like you set times, you're going to release every week. With the summit, it's like we set a date, we're going to deliver this event, and then we're going to do another one. It's sort of like that cadence for me keeps me in a good motivated track. Like it just keeps me working. And with the growth of the industry, it became more and more exciting. So I think like what drove me was just sort of like excitement. I saw opportunities. I was like, oh, like for zkHack, I was like, there's all these great, I mean, this is more Kobe actually, but we realized there was all these great applied cryptographers that wouldn't speak at the summit, that wouldn't really come on the show, but were contributing like crazy. And how could we kind of create something for them? And we did the zkHack puzzle competition, this online multi-week event that we started kind of late 2021. And all of a sudden we had this new group of people and we kind of could highlight them and learn about them. So for me, it sort of followed like kind of a cool opportunity, and then that opportunity would grow and then I would kind of pursue it. I feel like financially what came along, and at first, by the way, like the first ZK Summit, I think I lost 8K. Like I think I spent money on it. Like I made zero money. 1KX, who is still in our space as a VC, funded the rest of that first event. And I am eternally thankful to them for doing that, because I don't think there would have been a ZK Summit without them, without that first one. And so yeah, like at first it was not a money-making endeavor. It was also not motivated by that. But later on, we did get sponsors, and we started to find ways to finance what we were doing. And that grew and grew and grew. I think that combination of like creating this really cool space, but then also creating spaces that people wanted to pay to have access to, came organically. Like the first sponsor on the podcast, for example, reached out to us, being like, it was Trail of Bits, and it was Dan from that company, and he was like, what you're doing is awesome. Can we sponsor? And I was like, I don't know how to do that, but okay. And that's kind of how that even started. So yeah, it was all very, very organic. At the start, all of those companies found their footing, found some sort of way to have a business model that was sustainable. And that's how it worked. Yeah.
I want to touch a bit on the investment side of things and ask about ZKV or ZK Validator. So the way I understand it as of today, 2025, is that ZKV is here to promote ZK tech. And there are a few ways to do it. One way is to support decentralized networks from an operation standpoint. And a second way is through investments in small startups. Full disclosure, ZKV also invested in Gonyama. Yeah. Is this kind of like the right way to frame it? What is ZKV for you?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I would define it a little different today. I think what you describe is a little bit more ZKV when it started. So ZKV stands for ZK Validator. The original idea was we're going to run validators with the brand ZKV on it, and people will delegate, and we're going to earn a commission. And it was kind of a new business model. It was kind of interesting. I was basically pitched this by Joe Laluz on an episode I recorded. Joe was the founder of Bison Trails, which was eventually bought by Coinbase. They were the first team we worked with to do the validation on our behalf. And you can actually hear that in that episode where he's like, you could be a validator. Do you want to be a validator? And I was like, I don't know. And he's like, maybe you should. And that was him basically selling me on this idea. I met my co-founder for ZKV, Will, back in 2019. We had a lot of conversations about past businesses and like what we wanted to build going forward. And I sort of threw this idea out that like I just met this team that was doing validation, and Will was like, why don't we do it? And we set it up 2019. And the first network we validated on was Cosmos Proof of Stake. The thing is, back then, all the networks we worked on were Proof of Stake. They weren't ZK. And ZK Validator sounds like you're validating in ZK, but we weren't. Like, you couldn't. I remember us exploring it, but it wasn't possible at the time with the systems. And so what we did instead is we said, okay, well, ZKV, what we do is we validate on a network like Cosmos, and then we're going to invest in events and like education and kind of pulling together teams that could build ZK applications within those ecosystems. So in 2021, we started to move a lot of the validation in-house. So at this point, we were no longer just sort of a brand on top of another team's infrastructure, but we actually had our own infrastructure. And then more recently, what's changed is that, like, whereas before we were just like validating on POS and championing ZK, now you have ZK teams or ZK-based chains which need some sort of infrastructure. This could be validators, like in the case of Mina or something like that. But it could also be sequencers, provers. Like now you're dealing with the ZK part of things. And so ZKV now, especially because we are exploring things like provers and prover marketplaces, like we actually are like a ZK validator. We kind of, again, this is sort of a trend where it's like we set a name and then we become that thing. But we set it maybe a bit early when you couldn't do any sort of like validation actions on a ZK system because the ZK systems didn't exist yet. And I will say, like, I think even though ZKV still produces the State of ZK report, which is a quarterly kind of like look over the industry, it's a little document. I definitely recommend people sign up for it. It's a kind of a newsletter. We send it out. We do produce that, and we do some blog content around ZK, but we do way less ZK-focused events. I think I started to realize that I was like running multiple companies doing the same thing. Like, I was doing ZK events from ZKV, I was doing ZK events from zkHack, and I was doing ZK events from ZK Summit. And I think the team at ZKV also, like, we sort of wanted to focus a little bit more on actually running infrastructure, because that in itself is super exciting. And I think obviously all of these things have fed into each other. Like, the guests on the show have taught me about new systems. Then I would bring that to ZKV and be like, hey, this might be interesting for us. Then we can discuss it. I should say ZKV also expanded. We brought on 2 new partners, Philip and Kobe. Kobe has since left to move on to Bain. But like our team and we also have Cohen on our team and like a wonderful group of people running ZKV today. And so it is also kind of itself like less dependent on me. Maybe at the start it was very dependent on me, but it's more of a company on its own now.
So Anna, when you think about the long-term future, what's the ultimate goal or dream outcome for everything you're building in the ZK space?
My dream outcome is that what I've built can definitely evolve to stay on the cutting edge. I think that's my favorite place to be. I find, like, kind of going back to exploring these topics where I don't really know, I'm kind of wandering in the dark. I find that really fun. And I want to make sure that the project that we have and the companies that I'm running have that possibility to evolve, to kind of navigate upcoming trends and sort of bends in the road regarding a lot of this tech. Like, that's on the company front. That's like what I wish, is to continue to have something that's nimble enough, that's on the edge. I really just find that to be the funnest place to hang out. It's just like tech that isn't quite there yet, but is kind of promising. I don't know. For the industry, I mean, I think ZK is becoming like a standard. You hear people that are way outside of our space mention ZKPs as potential solutions. And I'm like surprised they might know about it. I'm talking about like, kind of famous people who are on Twitter or something. Like they know it. I don't know how they know it. They're definitely not in our ecosystem, but it's crossed their desk. They're kind of aware of this concept. I mean, I think ZK has been touted as like something that could eclipse blockchain at some point. I don't know if it really works that way, but maybe. Maybe in terms of importance, like especially in the land of AI and kind of the qualities that ZK enable for verifiability. These are things that I don't think we ever would have expected back in 2018 to be potentially as powerful as we think they could be. So yeah, I mean, I think ZK is on a very good path. I think it might be that the word ZK becomes eventually kind of like HTTP or something kind of like generic. I think there was this boom of companies that started their name with ZK. I did name all my companies starting with ZK. I got really into it. But yeah, I don't know if that's going to continue in the same way. But that's okay.
Yeah. I think there's some people claim that ZK is bigger than blockchain. I don't know.
Well, I don't think they're claiming it is now, but I think they are claiming that it might become.
Yeah. Let's see.
I think it depends on what metric. If you're looking at like the amount of money generated, I don't know. Blockchains have created a lot of money out of the air. And ZK isn't really set up to do that. But if you look at like impact potentially, or like how much is it used in like bigger, more used general computer systems, it might be. Like blockchain maybe really becomes just for certain use cases, whereas ZK could become like a type of like encryption that just is like in all sorts of things. Yeah.
Oh, by the way, is AI one of the other realms you're exploring now, as you just mentioned?
Yes. I mean, I remember in 2023, everyone was like, are you also going to pivot and become an AI podcast?
Yeah.
And I was like, probably not. I mean, I'll tell you the things that I'm exploring right now are actually So I did a series on the zero knowledge systems company. This is like a history, very personal. I've enjoyed doing that. I'm currently exploring ZK and lattices, which is kind of like allowing it to combine better with FHE and make it more post-quantum. I'm also exploring quantum and ZK, so quantum and cryptography. And I would like sort of a fourth path to be more AI and ZK. We have covered it before, like on the show. We've had a few episodes on it. I'm not exactly sure how to lock into it. I feel like there's lots of ways that ZK and ML are kind of being combined, and I'm not sure yet which one kind of really takes off. So I'm definitely on the lookout, but at this moment, like if anything, I'm like trying to program more of that, but I'm not exactly sure how to do it. So maybe later this year, you'll see more of it.
Mm.
Right now, I don't know, the quantum cryptography stuff is kind of more, it's a bit closer, I feel. I just did an episode with Yelena Vukovic from Stanford, who's a photonic quantum expert. We just released that episode, and I really liked doing that. I felt like that's kind of what I mean by the edge. It's like 1 foot in ZK, but 1 foot stepped out into something else.
So Anna, it's the time for us to bring you the routine question. So please name a project or a company that you're bullish on.
All right. Well, I don't think I can name one, but I do have there's a cluster of companies that I find what they're doing very exciting.
Nice.
And I would say it's in the ZK application front, so kind of what I was mentioning earlier. The folks at Cursive, the Tatseo CoSNARK folks, all of the ZK Passport, Open Passport, like there's Raremo, there's all those teams doing sort of like IRL ID, bringing it on chain. So I think it's really that level, that layer that's dealing directly with users. I'm finding that to be the most inspiring part. And it's so exciting and almost like fulfilling that, like, you know, back in 2017, we were so far from an application, and now we're getting to that place that applications of that level, like B2C or C2C potentially, like social applications, are actually possible. I'm really excited about that. That would be where my focus is. I think just to go back to the whole history, like when I started, everything was everything was research in ZK. I was so far from being able to contribute because my work in my startup before that had been like product. But there was no product of this nature back then in ZK that I could even conceive of, except maybe payments, like private payments. Now there's so many applications, they're getting closer to the user, and I find that inspiring. And I start to think like maybe I could build something again in that realm, you know, and it's taken a while for all of that infrastructure and tooling to be built. And it's not there yet, right? Like we still have a lot to do, but at least we can start experimenting. And I'm very excited about that.
Love it.
Cool.
Great. Thanks, Anna, for joining us today. Yeah, we learned a lot and we enjoyed all your stories.
Yeah, very funny talking this much. I keep running out of breath. I'm so not used to it, but it was fun. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Cool.